Thank you all for coming. I'll give my brief introduction so that Renee can have as much time to give her talk as possible. Renee Hoogland is professor of English here at Wayne State University. She is the author of 3 books: A Violent Embrace, Art and Aesthetics After Representation, published in 2014, Lesbian Configurations, published in 1997, Elizabeth Bowen, A Reputation in Writing, published in 1994. She served as the editor of Criticism Quarterly for Literature and Art, which comes out of Wayne State University. She served in that capacity for 6 years and edited the first volume of Macmillan Interdisciplinary Handbooks on Gender, which is subtitled Sources, Perspectives, and Methodologies. That was published in 2016. It is a 10-volume series for which she also acted as the senior editor-in-chief. Hoogland has published widely in her area of interest, including literature and culture after 1870, visual culture, critical theory, modern and contemporary art, gender and sexuality studies, and affect theory. She is currently working on a book, the projected title of which is The Other Side of Nowhere, or Haunted by Death, Thoughts on Contemporary Photography, and an unedited collection of essays entitled The State of Exposure, A Truth, Post-Truth, and the Politics of Looking. I can't end this introduction without thanking Renee for her considerable involvement in the work of the Humanities Center. I mean, she has won several of our awards, and we consider that a tribute to us, because to have somebody of her distinction apply for our awards is very healthy. In 2010, she won an open competition grant, and between 2010 and 2016, she was one of the leaders of the Visual Culture Working Group. In 2014, she won an award, President Award for Excellence in Teaching. That's not something we gave her, but I'm proud to announce that she won that award. And in 2015-16, she won our Marlon Williamson Endowed Distinguished Faculty Fellowship, which is the most prestigious award the center has given. And she has given several Brownback talks and participated in our conferences. And still she has time from all that academic work to be the vice chair of Academic Senate. So I'm delighted that she has found time from her necessarily very, very busy schedule to talk to us today on Time is Over and the World Has Ended, Kaleka Ala's Street Photographs as Energy Charts. So I welcome to the virtual podium Professor Renee Hoogland.
Thank you, Walter, as always, for your lovely and generous introductions. It's odd to do this in Zoom land, and I'm actually very grateful that you're willing to yet attend another Zoom meeting and see all your faces, although they are good tiny little boxes. I wasn't fully aware when Kennedy wrote to me that like the Zoom talks basically have been like 45 minutes. I'm like, oh God, I only have a conference paper to present. And that's the one that's on the flyer. But then I thought it might actually be kind of useful, but also kind of fun for me to say a little bit more about the book project for which this talk ultimately will be one of the chapters. That is the book, The Other Side of Nowhere, or Haunted by Death, that Walter just mentioned, Thoughts on Contemporary Photography, which I hope to be working on next week. Yeah, right. I will be just grading student assignments next week. I hope to be working on this book next year because I will have a sabbatical leave, but I also won the Josephine Nevins Keel Faculty Fellowship competition a year before the pandemic, and I postponed it because I realized that the pandemic would not be conducive to rigorous intellectual work with all its distractions. So I will have the whole year off, and I hope to actually kind of finish that book. So I would like to start with saying a little bit more about what that book hopes to do, and then I will actually give the conference paper, read a conference paper about Khaled Allah's work. And at that point, I will also start sharing my screen because I have some slides. But so The Other Side of Nowhere, or Haunted by Death, is a projected monograph in art criticism and philosophy. The project constitutes a contribution to an intervention in critical theoretical debates on photography in a digital age and after representation. It will consist of philosophically grounded studies of various sets of contemporary photographic work, from street photography to holiday snapshots, and from documentary to portrait and art photography. Each chapter focuses on a particular genre and body of work to explore and ultimately connect the book's guiding research questions. My interest in photography is long-standing. I've published standalone essays and book chapters on various photographers, but always from the starting point of theoretical inquiry. As much as photography appears to be haunted by death, I seem to be haunted by photography. My aim with this book is to bring together various of my abiding scholarly interests in representation and beyond, in art theory, in affect theory, and in philosophical approaches to art, as explored in my book, among others, in my book, A Violent Embrace, all inevitably gravitating toward that most elusive form of everyday aesthetic inscription, the photograph. The shift from analog to digital photography has fundamentally altered the ontological status of the photographic image. I want to investigate to what extent this shift can be argued to retroactively change the always already ambivalent state of the photographic image per se, and in what ways certain bodies of work can help us understand the material and effective operations of the technical image, not only in terms of technical apparatus, from analog to Polaroid to digital, but also in its various generic permutations. The fundamental questioning of its indexical function by current visual technologies notwithstanding, the photographic image appears not to have lost any of its expository power of a real that no longer is, nor its effective power of exposing us to its underlying image of life as it was, as it passes by. At least so much seems clear. Sorry, my phone is on. I'll reread that sentence. At least so much seems clear from the passionate responses to the widely publicized photograph of the bodies of Salvadoran migrant Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez and his daughter Valeria lying face down in the Rio Grande, the image of a failed attempt at finding asylum in the United States, an image of death. The association of photography with death is, of course, nothing new. In critical writing, the specter of death runs from Walter Benjamin through Roland Barthes and Susan Sontag to the 1980s and 1990s, when, in the words of Damien Sutton, photography became, quote, a dead space in critical discourse. Barthes has been especially influential in consolidating the link between photography and death, even if he started out his short book, Camera Lucida, Reflections on Photography, published in 1980, by exploring his appreciation of photography in opposition to the cinema and being driven by an ontological desire to learn what photography was, quote, in itself, by what essential feature it was to be distinguished from the community of images, end quote. This distinction, he concluded, was the inscription in every photograph of death. Looking at a picture of himself, Barthes submits, what I'm seeking in the photograph is death. Death is the ethos of that photograph, end quote. In trying to find out if photography existed, had a genius of its own, Barthes not only sets it up in opposition to cinema, but also seeks to chase away what he calls the ghost of painting, its absolute paternal reference, in order to position the medium closer to the theater. Photography, he maintains, insofar as it quote unquote touches art, is a kind of primitive theater, quote, a figuration of the motionless and made-up face beneath which we see the dead, end quote. Since the photograph, quote, mechanically repeats what could never be repeated existentially, end quote, it can never be transformed, being wholly ballasted by the contingency of which it is the weightless, transparent envelope, end quote. The reason then that Bacht insisted on, quote, that which is there in every photograph, the return of the dead, end quote, is his unwavering focus on the referent, the subject in any photograph. And I quote him once more, a specific photograph is never distinguished from its referent, from what it represents, and therefore has something tautological about it, end quote. While he admits that the photograph manifests itself in the here and now, in an eternal present tense, the impossibility to separate it from its referent cannot but lead to a definition of photography in its differentiation from other images in terms of depth. Bacht's emphasis on the reference seems to have lost most of its significance in the digital age. No image showing up on our multiple smart screens today can simply be assumed to inscribe an underlying pre-existing reality, a present actualization of a moment past. Today, the simulacrum, especially in its postmodern sense, would appear increasingly to actuate the no longer there as the real of perception in the first place. Paradoxically, then, digital photography and its almost limitless expository force points up the operation of photography, especially today, but perhaps all along, not so much in terms of reproduction or representation, or a pictorialism haunted by the specter of death, but as a mode of making and doing, as act. More precisely, the digital image sui generis appears to have brought into view the event of the photograph neither as the carrier of dead matter, nor as mere chronological organization of memory, but rather as essentially a creative act that depicts time as unfolding, non-chronologically, and hence as the very instant that saves memory itself from death. Seen as such, the photographic act consists in that which Gilles Deleuze restricted to the time image in cinema, that is to say, to present, quote, the powerful, non-organic life which grips the world. It would appear that it is partly the increasing democratization of the medium throughout the 20th century, but especially the widespread popularity and subsequent use of emergent technologies, such as the Polaroid instant camera of the 70s and 80s, the digital pocket camera of the 1990s, culminating in our current ongoing digital mediatization of our lives with smartphones that have changed the very nature of the medium of photography qua act as a mode of making and doing. That is to say, significantly, uses active photographic practice, which addresses and therewith, so to speak, cuts through several of the questions about art and the technical image that Bacht and Deleuze, each in their own way, were grappling with around the same moment in time. In blurring the boundaries between the classical traditions of painting and the equally traditionally presumed documentary function of the photographic apparatus, advancing visual technologies point up and register the ambivalence at the heart of the technical image as at once representation and aesthetic operation. The ubiquitous use of the digital camera technological apparatus that instantly produces its recorded past so-called realities to be shown to and shared with their subject at once, simultaneously pushes the question of temporality and visual exposure in its relation to both life and death to the fore. A question, as suggested, that may have gained increasing urgency in the current moment of digital immediacy, but that may well turn out to have been at the heart of the photograph all along. The photographic image and its exposing expository powers, that is to say, the photograph as act or event, defies the popular understanding of the snapshot as a discrete unit of chronological time, outside movement or becoming, to be captured in rational discourses that strictly separate the objective from the subjective. The latter, a common sense conception of perception, as Damien Sutton suggests, cannot do justice to our actual experience, and I quote Sutton here, experience is a combination of the subjective, the internal experience of duration, and the objective, the external experience of space, end quote. To consider the subjective and the objective as fixed categories of perception would mean to privilege the objective world of objects, which would deny perception itself, or to privilege subjective perception, which would deny objects their own existence. This intuitive view of perception, derived from Bergson, Deleuze summarized as follows, quote, "We perceive things where they are. Perception puts us at once into matter, is impersonal and coincides with the perceived object," end quote. For common sense, Bergson in his turn maintains, quote, "The object exists in itself, and on the other hand, the object is in itself pictorial as we perceive it. Image it is, but a self-existing image," end quote. This leads Sutton to conclude that subjectivity and objectivity are not two different perceptions, but that they should instead be seen as nominal values in a continuum of perception itself. One is neither totally subjective nor totally objective, end quote. What makes our experience of looking at a photograph different from looking at any object in the world at all, however, is the fact that we self-consciously see the subject of the photograph as seen, as perceived. We look at a surface, whether a print or a screen, at a subject that in and of itself presents itself as an object for perception, but at one remove. The operation of this perception is by no means less real than looking at an object. The power of images to move us profoundly in our embodied and embedded being suggests as much. By way of confirmation, I once borrowed a trick from W.J.T. Mitchell and asked my students to bring their favorite photograph of their mothers to class, and then told them to cut out her eyes. The students obviously were horrified and refused to do so. And yet, nobody will mistake the subject of a photograph for an object in space, a person, and proceed to wish them good morning. What happens then, not necessarily with any photograph, but surely potentially, is that the visual surface's affective force, its vibrancy, passes into sensation and as such affects us. It is the latter supposition that will drive the studies in this book, each chapter of which will focus on a particular photographer and photographic genre. My reflections will variously address questions of temporality and visual exposure in relation to both life and death within the context of contemporary affect theory and vitalist philosophies. At this point, I envisage chapters on Amy Saka's documentary and street photography, especially her work on Detroit, Tom Bianchi's Polaroid snapshots of gay men on Fire Island just before the AIDS crisis would wipe them all out, Khaled Allah's evocative analog series of crackhead portraits in one particular street in Harlem, talk of the subject of the second half of the talk, the ostensibly traditional and classic black and white, yet radically political portraits of Black, queer, and trans people by South African visual activist and photographer Zanele Moholi, and finally, the eerily hyper-realist, like surrealist stage portraits of Dutch art photographer Erwin Olaf. Okay, and this is the moment that I have to kind of try and share my screen and move to the second part of this talk. Give me a moment, bear with me. Yes, it's here. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, let me put it in presentation mode. Okay. So yes, the title of this part of the talk is Time is Over and the World Has Ended, Khaled Allah's Photographic Energy Charts. And the paper starts with a quotation from Deleuze's Pure Immanence Essays on a Life, published in 1995. My wound existed before me, not as a transcendence of the wound as higher actuality, but its immanence as a virtuality, always within a milieu, plane, or field, end quote. In most of his writings on art and its political effectiveness, Deleuze condemns photography for being inevitably figurative and narrative representational. This is not a simplistic rejection of photography for its still often presumed and equally frequently contested indexical function. Indeed, in his book on the painter Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation, published in 2003, Deleuze acknowledges that photographs not merely represent, but also, quote, are something, that they impose themselves upon sight and rule over the eye completely, and can thus lay claim to aesthetic pretensions, end quote. That the medium should nonetheless be excluded from the domain of art is because the photograph, he says, tends to reduce sensation to a single level and is unable to include within the sensation the difference between constitutive levels, end quote. Even if photographic images can be mauled, that is to say, for instance, in photomontage, and hence stop being merely figurative, Deleuze adds, they can still never create, quote, the kind of deformation that art produces, end quote, but only transform the cliche and hence remain figurative as a given, as a perceived thing. To think that photographs are art is then for Deleuze, as Stephen Zepke puts it, quote, not a question of taste, it is an ontological mistake, end quote. By focusing not so much on the representational content as on the vibrant surfaces of a specific body of photographic work, this paper serves to contest Deleuze's use of photography as a term of abuse and seeks to bring the medium into an affirmative aesthetic regime that moves at once beyond symbolic perceptive determination and, as a consequence, beyond the reach of global capitalism and codified systems of thought. The problem with photography is, Deleuze contends in Logic of Sensation, ontological as much as it is political, since photographs are not, quote, only ways of seeing, they are what is seen until finally one sees nothing else, end quote. Photographs create the person or the landscape in the sense that we say the newspaper creates the event. The medium forces upon us the truth of implausible and doctored images, he says. The concerns expressed here about photography echo more broadly considered political concerns articulated earlier in Deleuze's eerily prescient essay, Postscript on Control Societies, published in 1990, as well as in several interviews of the late 80s. In one of the latter, called What is the Creative Act, published in 1987, Deleuze does not directly address photography, but the medium hovers over the entire conversation, which revolves around the difference between information/communication on one hand and creation/recreation on the other, as distinct phenomena that don't have anything in common. Creating or inventing concepts in philosophy, or creating or inventing blocks of lines and colors in art, or of movement and duration in cinema, has nothing to do with communication. Communication, Deleuze says, is, quote, the transmission and propagation of information. And information is nothing but a set of imperatives, slogans, directions, order words, end quote. Information is communicated to us, and we are supposed to be ready to, or have to, or be held to believe. Worse, we are not even expected to believe what is communicated to us, but, quote, pretend like we believe, end quote. This is the same thing as saying that information is exactly the system of control that Deleuze saw emerging at the time and that has effectively taken over our contemporary world in terms of big data, metrics, evidence-based anything, and other meaningless yet powerful order words, not only but especially painfully felt today in academia. It will be clear that for Deleuze, there is no connection whatsoever between a work of art, invention, or creation, and the communication information power circuits ruling current societies of control. On the contrary, he posits, there is, quote, a fundamental affinity between a work of art and an act of resistance, even if it's not only the only thing that resists, and even if every act of resistance is not a work of art, end quote. Still, the artwork, which Deleuze elsewhere, with Félix Guattari, defines as a monument, as a, quote, block of sensations that owe their preservation only to themselves, and whose action is not memory but fabrication, end quote, does ultimately, he believes, necessarily resist. Art produces a deformation that neither communication or order words nor doctored images, photographs, can or are meant to generate. In light of Deleuze's infrequent yet insistent dismissal of photography from the creative, resistant realm of art on account of its fixing and closing informational qualities, it would appear somewhat perverse to pursue a Deleuzian path, however oblique, to say something meaningful or even interesting about the photographs that inspired these thoughts and this presentation in the first place. That I'm nonetheless doing so is first because, as some critics have maintained, today photographic images and technology are increasingly integral to most forms of contemporary art, and that Deleuze's writing therefore simply predates the emergence of photography as a potential mode of creative production. Photography, in this sense, may be regarded as itself emergent, as what Deleuze with Guattari calls a diagram or abstract machine, and I quote, "The diagrammatic or abstract machine doesn't function to represent even something real, but rather constructs a real that is yet to come, a new type of reality," end quote. In other words, the diagrammatic opens up to new movements, new assemblages that cut across the stratification of established systems of being and being. Secondly, I believe it to be Deleuze's mistake, a historically and politically understandable one, even more so today in our image-saturated Instagram world than in the late 1980s and 90s, to deny the photographic image the force of movement, openness, and deformation that he assigns to other visual arts by reducing its function to a merely communicative, semiotic, or significatory one. As German philosopher Lambert Wiesing reminds us, when we look at an image, we're not reading but seeing. And even if that fact does not obviate their possible function as signs, it doesn't mean that images, especially photographic images, are necessarily representations that refer to something else. As Wiesing succinctly puts it, what resembles does not have to refer. Let me try to bring these two considerations to the image work that interests me here. New York-based Khalik Allah's photographic portraits collected in his book, Souls Against the Concrete, published in 2017. Souls Against the Concrete comprises a series of 125 portraits of the migrant inhabitants, most of them quote-unquote crackheads, on the corner of 125th Street and Lexington Avenue in Harlem, New York. The photos were taken over a period of several years, all shot at night. Recto and verso pages follow a strict alternation between a color photograph and a black page, so that each portrait is both followed and preceded by total darkness. And I'll have the book here. I don't know if you can still see me in that corner, but so this is the book. And it actually has all these, like there's a black page between, surrounding on each side of every portrait. And I've tried to recreate this a little bit in the slideshow, but the effect is not quite the same. Recto and verso pages follow a strict alternation between a color photograph and a black page, so that each portrait is both followed and preceded by total darkness. The subjects in the images appear from the darkness as reflective surfaces, being brought into visual being by the minimal light coming from the actual spatial setting, street lights, shop windows, the occasional car's headlights. The lens, like the moon reflecting light, brings their faces into its field of vision. The film, developed in darkness, Allah only uses analog, brings the image to the surface, from negative to positive, as he calls it, emotion on emulsion, a vibrant surface of effective energy. And I will show you, while I keep reading, some images, some examples here. Admittedly, a highly specific space, a single street corner, and a particular moment in time. Pictures were taken between 2010 and 2016, from 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Determine the contours of singular moments in the subject's photographically captured lives or beings presented here. Yet, despite the ostensibly codifying operations of the closing shutter and the collecting of these still images in a single volume, the multiple planes on which these moments surface also escape representational conventions or code, and that which Deleuze calls the representational image of thought. As such, they generate, I argue, powerful instantiations of perceptual becoming, if not indeed what Deleuze in his last writing simply calls a life. I'll come back to this in a minute. Approached as images, as visual presentations, instead of representations of something else. That is to say, not so much as inscriptions of a past reality or as traces of the real, but as pure visibility, pure in the sense that it is not attached. The technical image, to borrow Willem Flusser's useful term, liberates the photograph from its informational and communicational plane, and the concurrent impossibility of ontological differentiation. This allows the image to play a piloting role, to constitute points of creation or potentiality, and thus to function as an abstract machine that, to quote Deleuze and Guattari again, does not stand outside history, but is instead always prior to history, end quote. In his introductory essay to Souls Against the Concrete, entitled Camera Ministry, Allah appears to point to such a reality by referring to photography as his inside joke with God, as his, quote, attempt to make the temporal become eternal, end quote, while recognizing that that is impossible. Rather than taking such a recognition as a reinscription of the indexical informational function of the photograph, however, and thus understanding these images to be traces of the past, the construction of a past perfect, the photographer's subsequent comments invite a diagrammatic approach, urging us to see instead of read his work in its pure visibility, as, if not quite a real that is yet to come, as pilot lights guiding us to a futurity, then at least as potentiality, as the construction of a future interior. And these are Ella's words. The world was over a long time ago. These photographs never happened. I shoot at night to remind people that we're in outer time, outer space. Time is over and the world has ended, end quote. As technical images, these photographs do not know depth, the layerings of paint, of bodies, of planes, of machines, to which Deleuze ascribes the deformative force of art. In contrast, their aesthetic pretensions lie precisely in their presence as surface creations, whose intensity, affect, sensation arise from their singularity as maps of light and darkness, as vibrant energy charts. This affective force resides as much in the portraits and pictures, with that dramatic contrast between black and white, light and darkness, black and black, shadow and figure, figure and ground, as it does in the solid black pages that do not so much frame as enable the emergences of various shades and vibrant colors of light and darkness without necessarily calling for them. In other words, the black pages imposing themselves on our vision in relentless alternation with the portraits proper are not blank pages waiting to be filled with meaning and significance. Instead, they mark the images qua images, as empirical realities to be encountered and seen, as presentations that, rather than as representations of something else. This, I suggest, is characteristic more generally of the art of photography as an emergent mode of creation and recreation, if not indeed of deformation. For as Jeremy Gilbert Rolfe argues, where the blank space, quote, once marked the absence of the sign by being a sign for absence, any technical image is now the sign of an invisible and ubiquitous technological presence, end quote. In its material empirical present, it is the affective force of the photographic surface that constitutes its function as an act of resistance. While I am by no means claiming that Souls Against the Concrete cannot or even should not be read as a social document, given photography's history and the book's topic, it most likely will be, I'm suggesting that such a reading ought not mistake the work's functioning as a material empirical force for some form of underlying meaning or reality. It is vital to remember that in Allah's words, these photographs never happened. As what I've argued them to be instead, that is to say, acts of creation, Allah's portraits do not so much serve to archive or codify or collect information, and are not in the first place interested in thus merely disciplining individual lives and beings in their historical time and space. Indeed, we recall we're in outer time, outer space, in what Deleuze calls a life. That is to say, a life that contains only virtuals, that doesn't lack reality, but that, and I quote Deleuze, is engaged in a process of actualization following the plane that gives it its particular reality, end quote. In his final writings, when he returns to the power of art to produce new aesthetic, intellectual, and conceptual possibilities, Deleuze touches upon, quote, the impersonal yet singular life that releases a pure event freed from the accidents of internal and external life. A life that is, quote, an anxiety no longer of individuation, but of singularization, end quote. Gilbert Rolfe clarifies this idea by submitting that in Deleuze, quote, the mind as transmitter and receiver finds not itself, but a self, the one it seems to need at that moment in the outside that meets its own outside, end quote. To whatever the mind attaches itself is a type of force, a force that opens up onto the new, among which the enduring power of creative art. Deleuze writes, to create is to lighten, to unburden life, to invent new possibilities of life, end quote. But whereas creation takes on a prominent role in such invention, he also reminds us that, quote, a life is everywhere, in all the moments that a given living subject goes through and are measured by given lived objects. An immanent life carrying with it the events or singularities that are merely actualized in subjects and objects. End quote. It is in this sense, I believe, that Souls Against the Concrete constitutes a creative act, piloting us to a real that is yet to come, while simultaneously guiding us through events and singularities to suggest a life, an immanence that is ultimately aesthetic, as much as it is actual, an energy chart in its own right, as virtual as it is real, actualized in a state of things and of the lived that make it happen. Thank you. All right, I'll stop sharing my screen here. And okay. All right. I did good time. So yes, thank you for listening. I would be happy to engage in conversation, answer any questions.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Just raise your hands. So if you want to ask a question or put it in the chat.
Nobody has any questions. This is like really the problem with Zoom. Like, oh God, I sat through this and now I have nothing to say.
There will be questions. Just people take a minute to formulate them. There's Ella.
Hi, Renee. So if you'll forgive me, it's good to see you too, for the ill-formed question. As I think I have a lot of questions for you. I'm also working on analog film stock production. So your book presentation was really interesting to me. But I wanted to ask you about this sort of final observation about the energy charts, and was wondering if you could talk more about how you're thinking about energetics, where that energy lies in the sort of planes of immanence that you're describing, and whether or not there's a sort of environmental way, as we are all worried about energy consumption, energy production, energy, footprints, if there's a way in which that sort of notion of a carbon footprint or a material footprint resonates with this project in some way.
It doesn't in my head, but now that you're talking about it, of course, it kind of begins to kind of open up new fields to kind of explore. I think I'm using that phrase, energy charts, as really like the forces of the universe, the kind of energy, the kind of a life forces that are immanent, but that, as Deleuze says, find their actualization in things, in the state of things, and of the live that make it happen. And it's in that sense, it's ultimately the most elusive, but also the most, and virtual, but also the most actual that I could think of. I've like, ever since I started thinking about the forces of the universe, that kind of was kind of a concept I had a hard time with initially, because it sounded too much like some kind of weird kind of new agey kind of God kind of function. The more I've been thinking about the forces of the universe and being aware of like how the forces of the universe are actually very actual and an actualization of the virtual. And I keep repeating myself, but because it is ultimately elusive, at the same time, it's the most real that I can think of. And I think what I'm trying to suggest here is then the ways in which photographs work, and I haven't thought this through, obviously, this is just a starting point. The way one can be moved by a still surface is kind of magic, right? It's a strange phenomenon that people are not just moved by the kind of historical realities underlying, for instance, that image of death that I referred to early on in the talk, but that one can look at a photograph and again and again and again, and the forces are still there. It's not as if the reproductive function of photography has taken away what people more readily accept about, looking at a painting, like, oh God, every time I see Rembrandt's Night Watch, I'm like moved profoundly, those layers of paint, and nobody kind of knows exactly who are in that portrait. Nobody kind of is interested in the historical reality, but is the kind of actual encounter with the artwork. that we have kind of accepted, right? As, okay, this is why we have to see the real thing. This is why we have to go to the museums to see them. My argument is really that photography has the same potential to create that kind of energetic, maybe even a closed circus at some point when you kind of look at it and you engage actively with it. So that energy never disappears, which is what Deleuze, it seems to me, suggests. But when he dismisses photography, that there is no such kind of energy flow possible because there is no differentiation between the planes, right? The constitutive planes. And that's what I'm trying to contest here, to bring the kind of energetic power of the photographic surface within a realm of energetic flow that we have kind of cordoned off as like art or the aesthetic, but need not be cordoned off that way. So I would like to hear how you see that connected to energy in a more kind of eco-philosophical perspective. Like maybe you can say a little bit more about that.
I mean, I'm thinking of the actual productive force that enables the photography and the sort of unique, I'm looking at signatures in gelatin, right? The fact that the diets of the cattle from what the gelatin was made affect the quality of the photographic image, and all of the different ways that you can read flows of life through that image onto the photo paper. I mean, silver, the sort of elemental qualities of the photograph that sort of also have, they can give it, I don't know if we want to talk about an aura, we probably don't in Benjaminian sense, but that there are these sort of elemental forces that converge on the surface or on the celluloid that indeed give it a status that hasn't been appreciated when you divorce it, or when you just see it as surface and not as process.
But would you then exclude the digital image from that, like the technical image in its more recent permutation, or would you include that too? Because there's no, like you're jumping on my screen. People, this is kind of weird. Okay, you're in a different corner now.
I don't entirely exclude the digital images. I mean, I think that the analog sort of helps get at things that underline the digital too, but maybe are, so I'm interested in that, the sort of remediation term, also because it's that environmental refashioning, restoring, recovering. So yeah, I don't think it's gone in the digital necessarily, although I am enchanted by the analog photograph. Are these analog photographs, by the way?
Yes, these are analog. But I have to say, like the difference, when I was looking at them in preparation for this talk, like actually they look much better on screen when the light comes from the back and when you can experience it as if it's kind of backlit, like, you know, slideshows in the old days when we still have little frames and put them in this kind of machine. That kind of light, and I think especially in these photographs, to kind of play with the kind of power of light, but also the power of darkness. Really, the pixels actually kind of enhance that quality for me, that vibrancy, compared to the actual pages of the book. But I admit I just ordered from Magnum one of his photographs in a little kind of print because I want to have it hanging on my wall. So my argument really is, or maybe not an argument, my hunch is, and this is what I would like to explore, is whether the digital actually doesn't open up a way to look at the analog differently as well. Like to kind of retroactively inquire into the operations of the technical image per se, more generally, even though they all operate in their singularity, but to actually kind of see the emergence of the digital image and its democratization as an opening up of the possibility to kind of inquire into the ambivalence of the photographic image pre-digitally as well. Does that make sense? I'm not talking in circles, I realize that.
No, and then I also, one last thing, I don't want to, there's a question in the chat, I don't want to occupy all the time, but I was just thinking about the segmentarity of the analog frame, like in film. So I was curious about the fact you mentioned you're talking about a documentary in that first chapter, and how you segment the project between the still shot and the moving image. but digital, I think it makes it easier for that distinction to be less important in certain ways, because you have that series of still frames and analog and not in the digital in the same way.
Right. Well, in a way, like no image is medium specific anymore, right? It can show up in all kinds of different kind of media today in ways that a printed photograph usually doesn't or never really did, right? That kind of end up in kind of like the snapshots of the 60s ended up in people's albums that were never opened again. Whereas now people share their images on their phones with everybody who's interested in looking at their cat and children's pictures at the most inopportune moments. Anyway, Elizabeth, I saw your hand earlier. Have you lowered it or?
It was actually a question about the analog, as you know, and the significance of that. I think you mentioned that Ala only photographs in analog, and if that was question was about, you know, the significance of that and the for his own sort of artistic mission, and also in relationship to your projects. So I don't know, you may have already said what you want to say about the analog, but I'm curious about that.
I've been thinking about this too. I think for Allah, it's like at least as he kind of describes what he is doing in that introductory essay, there is that kind of aspect of duration that he wants to extend, because he apparently kind of came home at 6 a.m. in the morning and then developed the film and then started actually printing the photographs all in the same kind of like, and then at the same time these photographs never happen, right? It's kind of this interesting kind of paradox about an unfolding moment or an extended duration, and at the same time this kind of unwillingness to attribute a kind of happening moment to photographs. You know what I'm trying to get at? But yeah, just like more generally, what I suggested a couple of times is really, and this is a hunch and it may not turn out to be interesting to think through ultimately at all. My supposition here is that the digital paradoxically has opened up new ways to think, for us to think about or explore the analog.
I saw Steve Chivero had his hands up for a second.
Hi, Renee. This is a really great talk. There's so many things I loved about it. It's hard for me to even focus on which I want to get at, but I just had a few thoughts which I'll throw out. I'm not sure it's a question. One is that I think it can be said more generally that sort of energetics and informatics are alternatives. So you're saying Deleuze is wrong to see photography as informatic, but I think for any kind of cultural production, we need to think of it in energetic terms instead of just as is the hegemonic way in informatic terms.
Right.
So that sounds to me like one way to nuance some of the stuff you're talking about.
Right.
I was also going to say in terms of analog and digital, I mean, this, again, a lot of what you said just reflects in odd ways things I've been thinking about. I used to be very worried about the fact that the digital wasn't indexical in the way the analog supposedly is, but now I actually think that doesn't matter at all.
Right.
And that's part of why I liked what you said about how these photographs look better when they're digitally produced on a screen as opposed to in the pages of the book. I mean, I think all these are all processes of energy transformation, and there's no reason to privilege either the digital or the analog in terms of energy transformation. And so, I mean, I'm inclined to suspect that there's something in what you're getting at which has more general application and doesn't have to be said as a new way to look at the analog, but as to say that that's not the right way to categorize the difference.
Right.
After all.
Right.
So I don't know if that's a question or just suggestions. The other thing I wanted to ask you was, you quoted somebody, I forgot the name of who was quoted about something can resemble but not without referring.
Oh yeah, that's Lambert Wiesing, Wiesing.
Okay.
German philosopher.
I'll have to look him up later if I can remember the
name.
Yeah,
he is like, I mean, he uses a phenomenological approach, which I ultimately cannot, fully embrace, but he has very interesting things to say about this kind of difference between reading and seeing. and especially the simplicity, which is unusual for a German philosopher, I admit.
Yeah.
When he says, like, also this whole idea that you kind of, when you look at a portrait, that you are looking at something that is a subject, but that the way I'm looking even at your images today, even though I know that you have some kind of reality aspects to you, I assume that has not disappeared during the pandemic. At the same time, I'm looking at images of you, right? Which is a very kind of different experience. So even though I'm kind of, I have this now, I see a couple of names, like I say this to students as well, like it's really, really hard for me to talk to a name tag, in the sense that you want that representation of the real person in order to be able to communicate. And I think he's very good at explaining how, and it's an interest. I'll send you a link if you want to.
Okay.
I've really benefited from his work.
I mean, part of what struck me is that I almost prefer to say the exact opposite, which is that images can always refer, but they don't necessarily resemble, because there's something in themselves. But
right.
But I don't want. I mean, I don't know how to say this. I'm interested in Deleuzean aesthetics as well, but I don't want to get rid of representation and reference, I think, actually. And when Deleuze, as a late modernist, keeps saying we're beyond representation, it's not representational, that's simply false, actually. But that may be just my peculiar.
It may well be false, but.
And I wonder about the people who so when you're showing these photographs, I wonder about the people. I mean, it's just.
Well, when you kind of think about Bach looking at a picture of himself, a photograph of himself, this is where he sees death, right? So, like, how do you look at a photograph of yourself, like whether it's a recent one or taken like 20 years ago? I don't know, what does it represent, or what does it present me with? And that's kind of ultimately a pretty complex question. Like, those two questions are, for me, irrevocably kind of like intertwined, because one also looks for kind of traces of a life that no longer is, or a self that no longer is, or a self that may kind of sustain itself as a kind of vague mood somewhere.
Well, I mean, again, this may be going too far afield, but I mean, again, if you say, look at a picture of yourself, it's really disturbing for me, and I think for many people, to hear recordings of themselves.
Oh yeah,
because your voice sounds different to everybody else. So I mean, but I feel creeped out by pictures of myself sort of in the same way. This kind of goofball you're seeing is how the people in the world think of me. I mean, I mean, I'm not sure how better to say it, but it's it's a problem. I mean, well, anyway, we can talk about this. I don't want to monopolize. We can talk about this too. I mean,
it's very
again. I think I'm doing a similar thing to you, is that I'm taking aspects of Deleuze and rejecting some of the things he says on the basis of other things which seem more deeply embedded in his thought. Right. I may be doing different than you are. And that's all I want to say.
Right. No, thank you. No, thanks. I appreciate it, Steve.
Renee, there's a question in the chat from John Michael Gruder. He said his pictures seem to reflect the situation of the addict, and many of the pictures were full of portraits. Was he reflecting on the situations or reflections of the addict? His picture seems to be one of those of the forgotten people of the world. Why was he so down on the photography, of which he appears to be very good?
Oh, I don't think Allah is down on photography at all. It's actually what he does for a living and what he pursues. I've seen a lot of more of his work. He also is a great filmmaker, very interesting films. Yeah, as I said, I mean, obviously, there is an aspect of documentation, and I absolutely do not suggest, as I said, that these images cannot or even should not be also read as an inscription of lives that live in darkness and in shadow. But I think that's not the only way that we necessarily want to, or definitely not the only way I want to look at them. Precisely because there is a case to be made that photography, even though it may be like central to or integral to a lot of contemporary, if not all, contemporary art practices, that the technological apparatus is always present somehow. but art photography has a relatively short history. It's not been that long, maybe only a couple decades that photography, especially as like seen as technical images and representations of something else, have found their way into museums and art galleries. That's not a very, the history of photography is a lot longer than that. And still most people, and I do the same when I kind of see a snapshot, like who's in it? And like, instead of kind of looking, what is it? Or what am I experiencing when I'm looking at this picture? That's a convention of seeing that I was born into, obviously, in the 20th century, and it's difficult to shed. But I do think that the digital has allowed us to, the emergence of the digital image allows for a kind of different way of exploring the question of analog photography as well.
I think I saw Ross Pudiloff's hand. Ross?
Yeah, just sort of briefly, I was struck by the phrase ontological status. And I wondered what it was that you had to have or didn't have to have for an object or a person or an image to have an ontological status. And that, I know that's a kind of hopelessly, in some ways, a hopeless question, but I'm still, I'm intrigued by it. And also when I first looked at the photographs, because I'm from an older generation, I looked at them as also images to be read. And I started reading the image. The first thing I saw was that they were taken from the corner of 7th Avenue and 125th Street. Well, of all, you think it's like Casablanca. Of all the corners in the world, you pick that one to take those pictures.
Right.
It's already brought. I mean, it's a great, I think it's a great, as an artistic work, I think it's really terrific. But I wonder about what its relationship to having an object or not having ontological status.
Well, I think the ontological status had to do that was a quote from Zepke, I think, Stephen Zepke, who argues that what Deleuze says about photography as like excluded from the realm of art means like if you actually include photography, that's an ontological mistake. That's what Zepke argues in his reading of Deleuze's notes on or thoughts. And they're sparse. I mean, Deleuze hasn't written a lot about photography, clearly because he wasn't particularly interested in what it can do. But yeah, Ross, I mean, I've been saying this for years now, ever since I started thinking about A Violent Embrace, the book Art and Aesthetics After Representation. Obviously, after representation doesn't mean outside of representation. I mean, representational activity and representational forces will continue to exert themselves. It's not as if it's like, oh, there is no such thing as clearly there is such a thing, but the problem rather is to bring into focus the presentation and presentational aspect of artworks. In my case, I mean, I've been writing about art now for quite a while. That has kind of allowed me to think things in a different way, which obviously does not obviate the possibility to look at Alain's work as clearly also historical and socio-historical, socio-political document that brings subjects into the light that have been living in kind of the shadows, and indeed that small corner of like 125th Street and Lexington Avenue in New York for a long time. I mean, the crackheads is like in quotation marks because that's what he calls himself and his subjects. But yeah, no, I don't think these are mutually exclusive projects. I do think that it's harder since we live in the wake of liberal humanism, and that we have learned to look at things in terms of surface and depth in presentation, representational terms and informational terms, that it's harder to bring the other ways in which a flat surface image, two-dimensional image may operate, may work, may actually kind of generate those kind of forces, energetic forces, than to say, oh, look, this is kind of an amazing kind of historical and politically relevant documentation of a group of people who have rarely been seen or been recognized as existing even. I mean, I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
I enjoyed the paper tremendously. It easily worth the 2,000-mile trip that I took.
Thank you, Ross. I'm glad to see you.
And as
Edwards 4. I thought I saw her hand up. Sorry.
Chris.
Okay, Chris has a hand up.
Hi, Renee. Great talk. I want to come back to your sentence, haunted by death. And I'm really struck by Kalilala's photographs where I'm seeing signs of life, smiles and raised finger and all kinds of other traces of life. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what does the photographic image do in that binary? Is there an oscillation between the two terms? Does it freeze one half of it? I mean, it's an interesting dialectic.
It's a kind of haunting question. I have to say that kind of underlies everything that I hope to be able to think about in the context of this project, because it's very difficult to get away from the idea of death in relation to photography, precisely because of the representational functions of the photographs, right? Like, it's not necessarily, we could even say, like, when Steve or I look at pictures of ourselves like made 20 years ago, or you, like, that person is dead, right? Like, you no longer exist in that way, because you have evolved and been transformed in the modalities of your being in time and space. But I totally agree with you that there is like a kind of very kind of lively, vivid energy emanating from that you encounter when you look at these photographs, that Allah's work. And that kind of maybe kind of circles back to Ross's question, is ultimately, even though these people may not have their existence may not have been recognized all that much, because they do live in these kind of, like, you know, shadowy corners of the world that do not often get a lot of attention or recognition in socio-historical terms, speaking in socio-historical terms. But at the same time, there is this paradox, right, about, like, the image exuding and expressing, or perhaps even generating life, and at the same time, what he says himself about, like, outside time, outside space, is that these images never happen, but those lives are still happening, right? In some extent, to some extent. I know I'm kind of like rambling on here a little bit, because it's a very difficult question to kind of get my head around. I've always kind of resisted Barth's insistence on death in relation to photography. But the more I think about photography, the more I think that haunting specter needs to be there in order to be able to say something about life, ultimately, in the ways that it's also like the whole phrase, like a still image, right? Compared to moving images, where kind of possibilities are suggested. I think there is. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that maybe we can think of it as a structure of supplement, like a superscript or something, rather than a ground.
Yes, I think that's what I suggested, and I haven't thought that through yet. Like the figure in the ground that I mentioned in passing, like, oh my God, maybe you should take this out of the paper, because I haven't thought this through yet. But I think there is something there that allows for, like, a way of thinking about precisely about figure and ground rather than a subject and frame. Whether it's a social political frame or a historical frame or the actual framing of a photograph, I think figure and ground is a helpful tool to think with in order to not but also, I mean, ultimately, you know, there is a vibrancy to death as well. I mean, death is not, like, necessarily that which is not. I mean, death is in those life pictures as well. I mean, I know I'm like now kind of like running around like a dog and kind of biting myself on my own tail, but that's sometimes what happens. But this is very helpful, Chris. Thank you.
I think Blanchot has something about death and supplement. I don't have the quote in my head, but when I find it, I'll shoot it.
Yeah, if you would let me know if you find it in your head, that'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we are in a position now where we can thank Renee for an excellent talk. The talk was recorded, and if Renee gives us permission, we will post the talk on our website, and then ultimately it is you can see it on YouTube, but you can also see it on the Humanities Center's website. And if you're able to look at it, then you might be able to have more questions and pose them to Renee, and I know that she'd be very willing to entertain them. But Renee, thank you so much. And as a token of our appreciation, the center usually gives and will give you 2 small gifts. One, a mask with our logo on it, and a journal with our logo on it. But we'll have to wait until maybe the fall when we're back on campus, and we will be able to distribute these gifts in person. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Walter, and thank you all for being here today and for giving me more food for thought. It makes me all excited about like getting started on this project.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Bye.